So welcome to our Beyond Awareness Action and Prevention series in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness and Sexual Violence Prevention Months during April and May 2022. If you missed any previous sessions on consent, boundaries, or relationships, we highly recommend you check them out on our YouTube page, which will be included in the chat, and you can find us on YouTube through our website and social media as well. Gender and sexuality have long been debated and discussed, and that is today's topic. So we are here to expand on our understanding beyond the binary and expand our understanding of gender and sexuality, as well as how we can act and prevent any future gender-based violence. So while we wait for people to trickle in, again, you can message myself or Natalie with any tech issues, introduce yourself in the chat, and let us know where you're joining from. Again, if you'd like to join anonymously using Slido, you can. Not required. You can also use the Q&A box on Zoom and the chat feature as well. We will have one Slido activity at the very end as a grounding activity. My name is Kylie. My pronouns are she and her, and I am currently the Sexual Violence Prevention Coordinator at Amelia Rising. And as of tomorrow, that person will be Natalie Austin. Natalie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Natalie. My pronouns are she and her. And yes, tomorrow I will be switching roles. And so, as Kylie said, we are just hoping for a bit of patience as we are in transition currently.
Thank you. And so to expand on what we do at Amelia Rising, we offer tools to help people ages 12 and up have healthier and safer relationships. Amelia Rising offers free counseling for people who have not had their consent respected. And if you'd like more information on our services, you can find us on social media or visit our website at ameliarising.ca. And you can also feel free to send us a direct message or connect with one of us throughout the session or send an email into the center. Amelia Rising in North Bay rests on the traditional Anishinaabe territory of Nipissing and Doki's First Nation. This territory is covered by the Robinson-Huron and Upper Canada treaties. We're putting a website in the chat and invite you to view what traditional lands and treaty you are currently on and what this means for you in the fight against sexual violence and gender-based violence. So if you are not from the North Bay area, you can visit native-land.ca to see what treaty and territory you are currently on and occupying. I personally feel that we cannot talk about violence without acknowledging the violence that is continually committed against the land and Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women and girls. And this happens through abuses of state power, colonial rule, and settler violence that results in intergenerational harm and trauma. And I recognize that these conversations that can be have some negative activators, and we would like to share a resource that offers free phone and chat counseling available 24/7 for Indigenous folks called Hope for Wellness. And you can access this at hopeforwellness.ca for chat support, or you can phone them for phone crisis and counseling support. I did want to continue with introducing this piece of artwork called Land Body Defense. Essentially, it is about violence on the land and violence on our bodies. And I want to point you in the direction of the landbodydefense.org, where you can read the entire Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies, Building an Indigenous Response to Environmental Violence Toolkit and Report. And so the reason I like to bring this art piece up at the beginning of workshops is because it does acknowledge and talk about how can we even begin to have a conversation about consent and violence when violence on the land is continually happening, and when we can't even respect the land, how can we even begin to respect people's bodily autonomy? And so I'd like to read out a quote from this art piece in the bottom right corner that really connects this to the conversations in this webinar series. So this system is inherently heteropatriarchal as it correlates ownership to power. slavery, rape, and loss of land are all a result of a culture that has no respect for consent and bodily autonomy as it relates to self-determination and empowerment. What happens to the land happens to the people. And so that is a very powerful, powerful statement. And I'd like you to sit with those thoughts for a few seconds and what that means for you in this conversation today, especially as we are talking about gender and sexuality in a society that has traditionally been very heteropatriarchal and still very much is. And so that definitely informs the conversations that we're having today and in the future. So thank you, Natalie, for putting those resources in the chat. And with that being said, Natalie, would you like to review our workshop goals for today?
Sure. So it is just, kind of what's on the slide, expanding our knowledge and understanding of what gender and sexuality are, and explore our own. It's such a vast, expansive area that I feel like there's so much to learn, and this is basically just like an introductory session for that. And understand the harms of gender-based violence included in 2S LGBTQIA+ violence and barriers to service, because it is an area that affects that community a lot, and to increase action and support to prevent future violence. And how we will get to these goals is by looking at our agenda. So we're going to talk about sexuality, gender. We are going to look at an activity called the Gender and Sexuality Galaxy from Action Canada, which is why we don't really have a Slido activity. I know it says on the agenda down there that we have a Slido quiz, but we actually skipped the quiz so that we could give you all time to do the Gender and Sexuality Galaxy. We're going to look at roles, stereotypes, and we're just going to look at some roles and stereotypes that happen, and then the fear, stigma, and shame perpetuating violence. And so actually at the end, we will have a Slido grounding activity instead of a quiz. So I will pass it over to Kylie, who will get us started.
Thank you, Natalie. And so with that being said, I'd like to start this conversation with acknowledging that when I was first taught about sexuality and gender, I was told that gender is being a boy or a girl, and sexuality means what sexual reproductive organs I have. Then my understanding was expanded to this magical acronym, 2S LGBTQIA+. However, there is much more to gender and sexuality than this infamous acronym, which is why we're here today. And so to ensure that we're on the same page, though, I would like to quickly review this acronym and what it stands for, just because some of us may not be aware of what these letters mean and the importance of them in this and why they're in this particular order even. So just for a quick review before we get started, and we will dive deeper into all of these definitions and identities a little later. But again, just so we're on the same page, 2S means two-spirit, and this is an Indigenous specific identity that we will discuss more in a little bit. I want to acknowledge that we do place the 2S, so two-spirit, at the beginning of the acronym, and this is to recognize that two-spirit is an identity that Western colonizers took away from Indigenous people through forced assimilation. And then many years later, identities such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender were the beginning of this acronym. So when I was in school, I learned about LGBT, and that was my initial foundation and understanding of being anything other than heterosexual. And so this acronym has grown to include identities such as queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. However, two-spirit and Indigenous people are still often left out of these LGBTQ spaces. And so for this reason, the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres advocates for two-spirit to be placed at the forefront of this acronym to recognize its history, its importance, and the inclusion or exclusion that this identity previously and still does experience today. However, we are we want to be inclusive, and we want to add and give them a space and just have a space for folks to be themselves, right? And so the use of the hyphen as well is to understand that two-spirit can exist on its own or be in combination with other identities. However, it is an identity that is to be used by Indigenous people only, whereas LGBTQIA+ can also be used by anyone, not Indigenous specific. And so again, to review, the L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B is bisexual, T is for transgender. The Q is often questioned and debated as to whether it stands for question or queer, and it depends who you ask and which acronym you're using. It's important to recognize that there is multiple ways to write out the acronym, and I can stand for intersex. A stands for asexual, and a plus sign typically is at the end to acknowledge that this is not an end-all be-all acronym, and it is important to recognize that this is not the end of the conversation, right? It's only the beginning. And to continue on with this conversation, we'd like to show you the Sexuality Galaxy, which was developed by Action Canada for sexual health and rights. And we want to ask, what are your immediate reactions to this galaxy? So you can either write these down on a scrap piece of paper, put them in a note on your phone, you can take a mental note, or put them in the chat if you would like to share. You don't have to, this is not, do not have to share, but what you can think about right now, or what are some of your immediate reactions to this galaxy? And we will look at the gender galaxy next. So you can write down any reactions if you'd like for yourself to revisit later, or you can share them in the chat. And so when I look at the Sexuality Galaxy, the first thing I notice is that romantic orientation and sexual orientation are two separate things. And you can see different identities kind of circling around those different types of orientation that relate to our sexuality. Some of you might not have heard of or seen some of these terms that are included in the galaxy, such as maybe polyamorous or aromantic, and some other terms that may not be as frequented in our vocabulary. So this is the gender galaxy. And again, the same idea and concept. So again, what are your immediate reactions to this galaxy? Again, you can write these down if you'd like to review them later for yourself, or you can share them in the chat if you wish. And I'll go between the two galaxies a little bit and review some of the terms, but I do just want to remind the group that this is for self-discovery and not for discovering and identifying others. For example, when we're looking at this, this is for us to reflect on what we may identify and not to be thinking about how others may identify or how we can identify others, because we can't just by looking at someone, right? And I do want to add in that the reason that we like to use the galaxies is that because we like to understand gender and sexuality as being ever expansive and changing, such as the galaxies. And we are constantly making discoveries about our gender and sexuality as we grow up, as we learn new things, as we learn what we like and dislike. And so for that reason, we do like the idea of the galaxies by Action Canada when we're having these conversations. So again, we do notice that sexuality and gender are different and separate in these examples, and that romantic orientation, sexual orientation, gender identity, and assigned sex are their own 4 different things that can make up our gender and sexuality as a whole. And so that is the beginning of our conversation as to how gender and sexuality go beyond that binary of boy, girl, man or woman. And we will expand on these conversations and definitions in a little bit more, but I don't want to review everything. So again, we have some definitions. These are the definitions that for the entire galaxy. And we will provide a handout for this in a little bit. So you don't have to memorize the definitions. Again, that's not the goal of this workshop, to memorize or know all of the definitions. This is for our own knowledge. So Natalie will share the resource in the chat during the workshop, and we can revisit it later on our own time to review all of the definitions. But again, this is for our own knowledge and understanding. And I do know that this is a very small text. So one of the definitions that I do like to point out again is two-spirit. And so it is in the bottom right corner. And again, it is a term used only by some Indigenous people to self-identify. And again, it's a term that two-spirit can sometimes either refer to sexual orientation or gender identity, depending on the way it is tied to that person's self-identity. So it is something that is not to be equated with being either with lesbian, gay, bisexual. It is something that can be separate, or someone that identifies as multiple different identities. And so again, these are for us to kind of review and go over and think about how they might apply to us, or just learning something new. For example, an intersex is a term that is often not talked about as a sex. And so it isn't, for now in the gender galaxy, it's being described as an umbrella term to describe people who have chromosomes, hormonal profiles, or genitals that do not typically fit into the binary medical social constructions of male and female. So this conversation, again, this is an introduction course. So I do encourage you to continue to do your own research and reading in regards to the gender and sexuality galaxies and where you may fit or what your galaxy looks like. So with that being said, we will move on. Natalie, if you want to sort of review what our sexuality can include and kind of expand on these different terms and the ways that we organize our sexuality and gender.
Of course. So as Kylie sort of mentioned before, assigned sex is female, male, and intersex. And these are like more traditional and binary, like it's a more traditional and binary and limited style of thinking about our sex and sexuality. However, we do want to clarify that our assigned sex does not dictate our gender or sexuality. So you can be born female, male. Intersex is a bit of a different conversation all on its own, but your gender identity is not dictated by that assigned sex, and it can influence, but assigned sex can influence our ideas and beliefs through like with our understanding of what we should be and how we should be and how we should act, which is why assigned sex is actually in the gender galaxy and not the sexuality galaxy. So I think a lot of folks sort of get confused. Well, like, what's the difference between sexual and romantic attraction? And so sexual orientation is about who you are attracted to. So it's a person's physical and or sexual attraction to others. And romantic orientation is, you know, who you love. And so it's how we experience romantic and or emotional attractions. And so sexual expression are the ways that a person expresses their sexuality, including the kinds of sexual activities they like to do or participate in. And this can be private and not necessarily public. And gender, we will talk about more on in a bit. So our sexuality can be affected by lots of different things: values, religion, culture, age, ability, experience, reproductive health, self-esteem, your body shape and size, social skills, mental health, feelings, and families. And it can differ from person to person and change over time due to positive or negative sexual experiences, interchange in beliefs, comfortability, ideas, thoughts. There's a term that we're probably not going to get into today because it's more down the road, but there's something called compulsive heterosexuality that can also keep a lot of people from really realizing what their sexuality is. And I would encourage you to look that up, because it is a factor of like what can influence the way people, know about their sexuality and express their sexuality. So this is why we believe it can be a spectrum or a galaxy, because it's ever expansive, growing, and we're constantly making new discoveries. And I'll pass it back to Kylie, who will talk about gender.
Thanks, Natalie. So again, as Natalie mentioned in sexuality, we did discuss assigned sex as being a part of our gender, because we understand that our assigned sex at birth can influence the way we may express ourselves, express our gender. For example, I was assigned a female at birth, and that inherently led me to believe to always express myself as a female woman and express myself as a girl in terms of gender and be very feminine. And that's a way that our assigned sex can affect our gender, by those preconceived notions and the way we're raised and believed to be. But sometimes when we are beginning to navigate the world, we may realize that our gender identity, our gender expression, and our sexuality are different than our assigned sex at birth. And so to expand on that, our gender identity is that internal sense or awareness of our gender. And this is something that someone else can't tell us. Our gender identity is internal. It's something that we have inside ourselves, and only we can identify that for ourselves. And so that is an ongoing, again, discovery and ongoing conversation with ourselves. And our gender identity might change over time. And my gender identity has certainly changed since from when I was in grade 8 versus to now. Gender expression is how we present or express our gender identity on the outside. So again, our internal identity and our expression on the outside do not necessarily have to line up. And this is again why part of the reason why we can't judge people based on their looks, and we can't label and identify others based on what we think and what we see, because we know that on the outside we can express ourselves in any which way, and it does not have to directly correlate to our internal sense of identity and what we like and dislike. Again, if you have any questions or comments, I encourage you to throw them into the chat or in the Q&A box. For our gender norms, so this is what we're talking about with having this kind of set of expectations or rules or scripts that are culturally specific and that inform us as to what is considered normal in our society. And so in terms of gender norms, even me sitting here today wearing like a denim button-up collared shirt would not necessarily be a gender norm for a woman or a female. Collared shirts with buttons are typically like a man's shirt traditionally, right? And so even just like having some of these stereotypes that or these norms that women should be, wearing like the skirts and men should be wearing suits. And so this like definitely informs us to what we consider to be normal, and especially again, women and girls having long hair is something that is considered a gender norm for women and girls. And again, we see men and boys having to contort themselves to fit into specific gender norms as well, such as not showing any signs of like sadness or exertion of happiness too. Men are often told to suppress their emotions and as to be and more in that gender norm of man and masculine. And gender stereotypes, again, is a belief of how we think men and boys or entire groups of people should behave. And so we apply that stereotype to that whole group of that whole gender. So again, thinking that all men and boys need to be strong, tough, tall, muscular, all of those things, and women and girls should be more domestic and quieter, petite, and some of these other harmful stereotypes that we unfortunately still see portrayed in the media and in pushed on to us by social media and culture. Again, masculinity and femininity are traits or characteristics that have been traditionally associated with being a male or a female. And these, again, play into the gender roles and stereotypes. For example, the idea that masculinity is tied to being a tough, strong person who does like the housework, the dirty work, and, you know, suppresses emotions. They're not supposed to cry. They're not supposed to be overly happy and cheery and excited. Most photos of men we see in the media, they have a very stoic expression. And so for that reason, sometimes having these really rigid gender stereotypes and norms can keep us from really expressing our true gender identity and expression on the outside. And we'll move on. And so as we continue this conversation, for a long time, gender has been thought of as only being a boy or a girl, or being male and female, masculine and feminine, and sticking into those really rigid categories and making sure they all line up. Boys are males and they're masculine, girls are female and they're feminine. And we're here to tell you and help you think about how these can be expanded on and not so rigid and binary. And so when we say that these terms are binary, this means that there's only two, but we've learned that this is incorrect and that gender is fluid, non-binary, it's ongoing, it's changing, and it's much more than being a boy or a girl. And if we identify ourselves as being a boy or girl, that's totally okay. And that's fine. Like, for example, I identify myself as a girl, but I don't want to be held to those rigid beliefs that girls have to be super emotional or domestic, or be the household person and stay home with kids and be very matriarchal. And so this is an idea of how our gender can change and are much more than just being tied and associated with being a boy or a girl, being masculine or feminine. Gender is that way we identify ourselves internally and how we express ourselves externally. And so again, only you have the power to decide how you identify and how you express your gender. This isn't a conversation that we have to, again, figure out what other people are by expressing how they express their identity or how they identify. Again, this is a conversation for us to really look inwards and think about how we've been taught to believe our gender and sexuality and how we navigate the world based on some of these beliefs. And so again, I do encourage you to check out the Gender and Sexuality Galaxy activity that is included in the chat. And again, you can email Natalie to get a copy of that as well. And the activity will really ask you some questions as to how your gender and sexuality might have changed over time and how you see them maybe changing in the future, and gives you time to review all of the different gender and sexuality identities and ways of expression and ways to feel. And I know when I looked at those galaxies, it was surprising to see so many different identities that I hadn't even considered or known about. And then reading them and being, hey, that actually sounds like me. This is awesome that this exists and I'm not just, out here floating around alone. So we do really encourage you to do that activity on your own time, which is why there is no Slido participation in this workshop, because we do just want to we want you to reflect on that and do that activity at the end of the session. So moving along, I would like to expand on this conversation of pronouns. So pronouns are again a way that someone might express their gender. So using she, her, he, him, they, them, or Zer, or other pronouns are important to consider when interacting with people. And pronouns help us inform how to best address someone when interacting with people. And they're important because we use them every day, whether we notice it or not, or whether we do it intentionally or not. For example, when I'm talking about my colleague Natalie, I might say Natalie's a really awesome person. She is super reliable, dependable, and puts her heart into everything. And I'm using she, her pronouns because I know that's what Natalie uses. And it's something we do every day, sometimes without even thinking. And so when sometimes we get asked, are pronouns only for the queer community or only for the LGBTQ+ community? And no way to that. We use pronouns every day, like I said, when we're talking to people and talking about people, especially if we don't know who we're talking about. For example, if we find a missing cell phone, we might pick it up and be like, oh my goodness, someone lost their cell phone. I have to get it back to campus security to make sure that they can, find it, or maybe I'll bring it to the library. And when we don't know about someone's pronouns, we tend to just default to they, them pronouns without even thinking about it, right? So we do use pronouns all the time outside, outside of the LGBTQ queer community. And I do want to acknowledge that pronouns are an important part of our identity, like I said about our gender expression and the way we identify and label ourselves, but they're also an important tool in violence prevention within the queer community. So I want you to remember how we talked about how gender and sexuality are beyond the binary, and our pronouns can also vary. So just like how our gender and sexuality can change and can change over time, our pronouns can also be determined, can also change over time. And they can't be determined by just looking at someone, similar how we can't just look at someone to identify what their gender and sexuality are. And so for this reason, we often in the queer community, we see more specifically trans and non-binary people are often intentionally misgendered by people using the wrong using the wrong pronouns or using the wrong name on purpose and intentionally. And we see a lot of trans and non-binary people subjected to hate speech and slurs because people aren't respecting their name or their pronouns. And so using our correct personal pronouns is a small step towards gender-based violence prevention and awareness. And when we really take the time to acknowledge folks and use the correct pronouns and use the correct name that they would like to go by, and that like what their name is, it's a way that we can acknowledge and create space and normalize the use of just respecting people's names and pronouns. I find it such an odd conversation that we're still having, that it is hard for a lot of us to just change the use of someone's name. But I do encourage, I always include this Winnie the Pooh graphic because it makes me laugh that Winnie the Pooh can always respect pronouns, and if Winnie the Pooh can do it, then so can we. I do see a question in the Q&A and a chat, and yes, we are recording later, and it will be on our YouTube page as well. I think that's all I'd like to include on this slide. Oh, I do have a comment actually about preferred versus personal. So again, this is the whole idea of the conversation that gender and sexuality are change, and that our knowledge changes over time. So for the longest time, I was used to saying preferred pronouns, and now we have kind of adapted to personal pronouns, simply because the term preferred implies that someone prefers to use this name versus another name, and it's actually not a preference. It is their name, and so they're not telling you that I prefer that you call me Pam, but it's okay if you call me Jim, right? No, they would rather their name is Pam, and that is their personal name, and their pronouns they use maybe she, her. So again, it's just something that when you think about yourself, your pronouns or name are not preferred, because you wouldn't prefer that someone call you Kylie, she, her. That is my name, and I would like you to use those pronouns in that name. It's not a preference, it's my personal name and pronouns. And so when we try to reframe and think about things like this, it often it helps us understand how we can do better and move forward together. Natalie, would you like to review these awesome infographics by the 519 in regards to pronouns? And again, if you have any questions about pronouns and gender identity and all of this fun stuff that may be new to you, please add them into the chat or send us a follow-up email afterwards. And again, yes, this is being recorded, and you can share the recording with others, so we do encourage you to attend another workshop or provide them with the resources as well that we also have in this webinar. So thank you. Go ahead, Natalie.
Thanks, Kylie. Yes, so as Kylie stated, these graphics were made by the 519, and it just includes some strategies and suggestions for using gender specific and gender neutral pronouns, and also starting conversations. And so I would like to bring your attention sort of to the left middle, and they have sort of a review, ask, respect, practice. So it's sort of like review, introducing yourself with pronouns in meetings, name tags, business cards, email signatures. Like, you know, if you don't know somebody's pronouns, then it could just be best to use their name. You know, and if you don't know their name, then you can ask their name. And to avoid using, you know, assumed gendered titles and opt for something more neutral. So, you know, if you're addressing a room, instead of saying, hey guys, or hey ladies and gentlemen, you can say, you know, hi everyone, or hi honored guests, or welcome to the meeting, everyone. I personally use the term folks a lot. I say folks, hi folks, or hi friends, you know, even if you're not friends. It's just sort of a more gender neutral way of addressing everybody. And it does take some practice, but once you know, figure out what gender neutral terms like work for you, it's actually pretty easy. And, you know, like they isn't just a term, isn't just a pronoun used by non-binary people. They is they, you know, I can say they are, you know, Kylie is an amazing co-host. They are very good at what they do, and I hope they have a great time in their new position. And it was very easy, and it doesn't mean that Kylie doesn't identify as a woman. It just means that I've used a gender neutral pronoun for her. So you can, if anybody has any examples that they want to put in the chat, they are free to do that. And on the other side, they do have a graphic about, you know, of how to avoid the assumed use of gender neutral titles and emails. And we can provide you with these graphics if you email me and ask for the slides. So on the next slide, we are going to talk about allyship and advocacy. And so this is another graphic by the 519. And we're going to sort of like go through like what makes someone an ally or an advocate. And so the first thing to know is that an ally is a thing, but allyship and advocacy are actions. It's a verb. It is a thing you do, not a thing you are. And it, you know, requires active and ongoing commitment to do better and to doing better and supporting your queer community. So you can't just say I'm an ally, but not follow it up with any action. You know, and it doesn't have to be big action, just any small action to support, you know, the queer community or really any community. And this can look like standing beside them, behind them, or in front of them for protection. We can talk about this more in just a minute. So questions you can ask yourself to evaluate your allyship and advocacy for a particular group or cause is by asking how you are practicing allyship and what advocacy options are you exploring versus making the statement, I am an ally. And then ask why. Like, what is your motivation? And if it is to show off or sort of like ease guilt, your advocacy and allyship, unfortunately, like those are not the most sincere motivators and can cause harm. Supporting as an ally should be about, you know, supporting those people and making sure that that group is getting, you know, the justice or the rights that they deserve. So this can include supporting, you know, people in the 2S LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, writers, musicians, creators, educators, etc. Sharing, liking, following, you know, if you can, and if it's safe, going to a protest, seeing how you can help at an initiative, and, you know, signing petitions. You know, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the big advocacy work happens, where laws and policies are made, because those are the things that do affect people, but it's not as glamorous as, a big event or a protest. So to review, supporting can be beside someone, in front, or behind. So beside is listen to them and walk with them through an experience. So for example, using public washrooms. In front could be standing in front of someone to help them avoid harm and physical hurt, and standing between a friend and an officer during a march. One of the best examples for this is during Black Lives Matter protests, where often like people with white or light skin would stand at the front or on the sides in order to protect folks from harm by officers or other enforcement. And so behind could be supporting medical, sexual, and health decisions. But really it is, it's sort of something that has to be assessed on a person by person basis on what, what their needs are and what is best for them. And so I will pass it over to Carly, who will talk more about harm reduction strategies.
Thank you, Natalie. And so easing into the harm reduction strategies conversation, I do want to acknowledge that practicing allyship and advocacy is a way that we can help mitigate harm and future harm, again, by signing petitions and attending protests, and to make actual change is a way that we can prevent harm from happening in the future, and advocate for funding for better supports and access to spaces and professionals that can help and support Two-Spirit, Indigenous, and LGBTQ and individuals, and that are actually trained and informed in all of this information and research. So part of harm reduction and why it is important is because there's an immense amount of harm happening in today's world, despite how far we have come. I do want to acknowledge that 1 in 3 trans youth have attempted suicide in the past year. That was in 2015, and that trans individuals are 2 times more likely to think about suicide compared to their LGBT counterparts. And so knowing that suicide rates among our trans and non-binary and other queer friends and family are so high is something that needs to change. And one of the reasons that suicide rates are high in these groupings is because of the amount of marginalization that they face, discrimination and harm, even the misuse of pronouns and gender titles and names intentionally is a very homophobic, gender-based form of violence that occurs a lot in these communities. And so having even one accepting adult, LGBTQ youth were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in that past year. So we can see that having people who accept and acknowledge and are supporting our trans, queer, and even gender and sexually diverse people and family members and community members and friends, having that open conversation and having that accepting adult or someone in our life can significantly decrease the likelihood of a suicide attempt or even thoughts of self-harm. And again, in forms of harm reduction, like having access to these, to medical services, having access to mental health services and sexual health services without discrimination, without barriers, without re-traumatizing medical history questions, or without medical staff purposely or misgendering or just you see sometimes on forms it will ask you what your name is, what your legal name is, and then what your personal name is if it's different. And if people are doing that, it is important to recognize where and when it is safe to use those personal names, and to actually use them, not to just ask and then not use them down the road. But that's a whole other conversation. And so again, in regards to harm reduction, some ways that we can engage in that as an ally or an advocate or even someone within the queer community is just always continuing to always recognize, listen, and support each other, respecting and affirming each other in our gender and sexuality, making space for LGBTQ plus and two-spirit individuals. And what I mean by that is when we're hosting, sometimes we see at certain Pride events that Indigenous and two-spirit folks are left out of that conversation because they're not queer. And there's a whole dynamic, unfortunately, that still exists today with exclusion. So when we have these conversations, we want to make that space and we want to acknowledge where privilege has existed in certain conversations in regards to gender, race, sexuality, religion, immigration status, housing status, and all of that. So recognizing how we can continue to support allyship moving forward, whether it's beside someone. So, actually assisting someone if they would like support to use a bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, whether it's in front, so, protecting someone at a protest from harm from another community member, or even behind them, again, just supporting them in their decisions. And if they're looking for support for, mental health or counseling supports, being behind them and supporting them in that decision, and helping them get the information that they need, if that's what they would like. So harm reduction can also include the use of inclusive resources in education. So if you're a teacher or a medical professional or a service provider, including resources in education that reflect everyone, not just cisgender, heteronormative, white couples. Even at Amelia Rising, we do try to obviously include a lot of resources that are outside of the victim narrative of woman and man heterosexual domestic relationship. We do want to recognize that violence can occur in any types of intimate partner relationship, domestic relationships, and relationships that are not cis normative. So that means heteronormative. And so in expanding these narratives and conversations as well outside of the heterosexual narrative. So harm reduction essentially starts with informing ourselves, informing others, and educating ourselves and others in how we can move forward and support people around us and advocate for change in the future and implementing these things moving forward. And so with that being said, we have a few red flags and course of control strategies that have been developed by Dr. Faith G. Harper in Forge Forward. And so the reason that we include these is because in regards to what I had just mentioned about oftentimes we unfortunately see gender-based, sexual-based violence have a stigma attached to it that it only happens in a heterosexual, cisgender relationship between a man and a woman, and that is not true. Sexual or domestic violence can happen between any two people living together. It does not have to be an intimate or sexual relationship. And then that being said, though, even between relationships within the 2S LGBTQ plus community, there can still be elements of coercive control and violence. And so we do want to acknowledge that because it's often not talked about, and it's often brushed over. It can be really harmful, again, when we think about our friends and family that are missing out on this information, or even ourselves that are missing out on this information, that we are not alone if we are experiencing these things and we fit outside of that limited narrative that is often pushed onto us in, media and in culture. So some red flags that have been shared with us from Dr. Faith G. Harper in Forge Forward is someone who is disregarding or diminishing, disrespecting your gender or your identity, whether it is your name or your pronouns, denying your identity. So using language like you're not a real man or a real woman. And again, these coercive control strategies can be within, again, an intimate partner relationship, or like a domestic relationship, or a friendship, a work relationship, a family relationship. And so these are, again, not just for intimate relationships or romantic relationships, and these, can exist outside of that. So things that we often unfortunately hear would be that, like, telling you that no one will love you, or you won't be loved by anyone because of your identity. You're being told that you're an embarrassment to communities that you belong to. So for example, and if you're an embarrassment to the church community or your sports team because you identify a certain way, refusing to not being able to actually discuss your identity or your gender around people because of the way you identify or the people that are around you in regards to how they treat you. Natalie, do you want to jump in here and finish the list?
So, there's other things on here like, weaponizing negative feelings about you to hurt you, or having someone like trying to save you. Something that's not on this list, but is definitely a hot topic in the in the community right now, is biphobia, and sort of erasure around people who are bisexuals, saying that actually, like, people who are in straight passing relationships, if it's like a man and a woman dating, that actually they're not bisexual, or they're not gay or part of the community. But then also if somebody is a man dating a man, or non-binary, like if people are in a seemingly like gay relationship, then it is assumed that they are not attracted to anyone other than that, or sort of like downplaying their attraction to like men or women, or what would be considered more like straightness, or just like not really acknowledging that bisexuality is like a real sexuality, and that can have a lot of negative effects on people who are bisexual because they feel like they don't really fit anywhere. And so that was like one thing I was thinking of that like should be on this list but isn't. So it's really just like, and I know that in terms of like gender and sexuality, there's folks who just like have not understood the journey that trans folks go through with people who are gender nonconforming. And there's a lot of talk about like you said, that someone's not like really a lesbian, not really, not really gay, or like how can this be? So it's sort of just these things exist, but are not, not seen. Like people don't think these things can really happen. They think it only happens within the confines of a straight relationship. And so that's sort of like why we're here today, is to let people know that this happens too. And we have a comment.
It's essentially confirming what you're saying, that as someone who identifies as bisexual is being like shamed by their own community for being bisexual. Like that goes back to like the telling you you're an embarrassment to communities, but not only an embarrassment, but like not being able to fit into the community that you should be welcomed to. And that kind of goes back to, again, what I was saying with some Two-Spirit and Indigenous folks not being welcomed into LGBTQ spaces, because some spaces have excluded them because they're not LGBTQ plus, they're Two-Spirit, but we know that these can exist, these can coexist. And so again, yeah, just any type of like control or like weaponizing, restricting of like feelings of your gender, of your sexuality, of your beliefs, anything like that is a coercive control strategy, which is why we often picture the puppeteer kind of working the strings, telling you these things that are going to internally upset you and cause you to stress, and are going to in turn affect the way you act, think, and behave about yourself and your sexuality and gender. And again, and fetishizing your body is again something that is super, like, it's not talked about enough in these conversations, but it is something that is definitely a red flag when especially well, in any conversation, but just especially in our queer and not queer, sorry, trans and non-binary folks, and people who may or may not be transitioning, or people who are going through gender dysphoria or body dysphoria or anything like that. The fetishizing of body and restricting any access to medical or personal affirming items like clothing, prosthetics, your chest binder, therapy and hormones and surgery, things like that, can also, again, be those coercive control strategies to suppress who you are and control you as to who you should be or shouldn't be. And so again, we do know this is a tough conversation to have. And so we do have, again, at the bottom of our slides, we include Youthline. The name itself is kind of misleading because Youthline actually serves anyone under the age of 29, I believe it is. Yep, 29 and under in Ontario. They have anonymous peer support for 2S LGBT folks, and Trans Lifeline is also another amazing resource that is also Canadian and American. So if you have American friends and family, you can also reach out to Trans Lifeline as well. So again, here are some of the other resources that we've collected and that do have specific resources for Two-Spirit, transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, the whole, everyone, and have more of a understanding beyond the binary. I also wanted to include sex positive families. They're not on here, but sex positive families is another resource for younger, for folks with kids or caregivers, or people who work with children and looking to have some of these conversations. Definitely check out sex positive families. And yeah, anyways, Trans Lifeline, LGBT Youthline, the 519 in Toronto. I have this book here called One in Every Crowd by Ivan Coyote. It's a collection of short stories that I highly recommend checking out. And if you have any other resources or books or podcasts that you want to share, put them into the chat, or feel free to send us an email or check out our website as well. We have tons of resources. So this is almost pretty much the end of our workshop today, because well, first of all, we want to check in with you. We know these are hard conversations, and so we want to ask you to share what are you going to do for boring self-care today? And when we talk about boring self-care, you can join us anonymously on our Slido to share what you might be doing to take care of yourself today. Or if you're comfortable, you can share it in the chat. So some examples of boring self-care might be having a shower. So when we talk about self-care, sometimes it's really inflated to be something that involves a luxurious bubble bath, a glass of wine, maybe a cozy book and some quiet time. Like for us, we like to really think of self-care as something that can be boring. And this comes from Make Daisy Chains on Instagram. And she is a occupational therapist that talks about boring self-care and how self-care is something that is any action that we do to take care of our body and take care of ourselves, whether it is showering, whether it is changing your underwear, brushing your teeth, taking your medication. And so in that regard, what are some ways that we are going to care for ourselves so that we can be there for ourselves and be there for others as well? And so you can add that into the chat or use the Slido information in the chat to join. I will just click to the next slide just to remind folks of this Gender and Sexuality Galaxy. So again, that was in the chat added by Natalie. And if you have questions or would like it emailed to you, you can reach out to Natalie as well, and she will provide you with the slides, the slides, the activity, and the recording for this module will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week. And so the purpose of this Galaxy activity that, again, we're not going to do with you because it's very personal, but we encourage you to check out is essentially self-exploring your own gender and sexuality and how this might have changed over time and our thoughts and feelings in regards to our gender and sexuality. And so this activity can be used for yourself, for students, for other youth in your care, and it is available on the Action Canada and Sexual Health and Rights website, titled the Gender Galaxy activity. But again, if you would like the direct information, just contact us and we can provide that for you. And with that being said, next week we are offering, well, not we, Natalie will be offering an introduction to sexual and gender-based violence. And yeah,
if you kind of like exit out and then like reshare, the QR code for the certificate and survey will be there.
Oh, okay. Just a second.
But yes, next week it's an intro to sexual and gender-based violence. It's another sort of like intro, how to like recognize the signs. So we're hoping that we will see you there. Well, me, and her name is Trish, and she will be joining us from the Sarnia Lambden Sexual Violence Assault Center. So
thank you, Natalie.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, and that, yeah, next week's workshop will include, you know, that conversation that I mentioned about the difference between like domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and touching on different, you know, just expanding what violence means, so, and what it looks like. So we definitely hope to have you there. Natalie, I don't have Slido open. Do you know if anyone's responded or anything?
Someone has.
Yeah.
They said stay off social media. Yes, that is a big one. One I am trying to do as a daily practice for self-care. You know, along with just like eating, showering, yes. Walking.
Someone added that they attend groups at CMHA and Amelia Rising. So that's their self-care. So we're happy to hear that. Yes. I think for me, my most boring form of self-care is just, wait, what day is it? Tuesday? Yeah. Tuesday. Maybe I'll shower today, wash my hair. Myself. I think that's my ultimate form of boring self-care, is giving myself a really nice, long, spoiled shower with a hair mask. So thank you all for joining. Again, we really hope that you are able to do that Gender and Sexuality Galaxy activity on your own time. And if you have questions about that activity or thoughts or insights, please feel free to send them to us afterwards, or include them in your evaluation survey. So if you're going to do the activity, you can complete the evaluation survey after. You will get you know, an emailed link to your eval survey. And again, I also want to apologize to anyone who has had any issues with downloading your certificate. Sometimes our analytics through Jotform don't always work, and we have to do it manually. So thank you for your patience if you did not receive a certificate, and you can always reach out to us if you have any issues in the future. And so with that being said, I will stop screen sharing, or I will stop recording.